Hi, my name's Peter Hennessey and I'm an artist. I've been invited by ACMI to include 3 of my sculptures in the Star Voyager exhibition, as well as develop an interactive activity for children. I started out studying architecture, but while I was at architecture school, my wife and I started an artist-run space in the city, and during that period I exhibited regularly at that space and in other spaces. So I always had a visual arts aspect to my life, even while I was studying architecture. When I finished architecture school, instead of going off to become an architect, I started a small new media design studio. Eventually we got to the point where we were doing less and less commercial work and more of our own artistic practice, and then in 2004, after probably 10 years of doing that, I commenced doing full-time art practice as an artist, making mostly sculpture. I've always been really quite interested in the space program, not necessarily because of the heroics of it, but because I can see something in the way that the scientists and programmers at NASA had to work that remind me very much of the way an artist works. They are interested in doing stuff that is very much about expanding human understanding and knowledge, but at the same time everything they do has to be couched in kind of technological or economic or military terms. So for example, the lunar program occurred because it made propaganda sense. But the people who actually worked on designing the processes that got people to the moon, they weren't interested in the propaganda issues. They were interested in the process of getting someone to the moon. But they have to kind of make it work in whatever political environment they exist in. And so there's a certain kind of similarity to the way an artist works. An artist makes their art because they want to make their art, but at the same time they have to find a way to fit that art-making practice into the kind of economic and cultural world that they live in. And so I'm interested in that connection between sort of the astronomer and the artist. Star Voyager includes 3 of my sculptures, the largest of which is my Voyager, which is a full-size reenactment of the Voyager space probe. The other works included a My Lunar Rover and My Mission Control, both of which reenact objects from the NASA lunar missions. My work focuses on what I call reenactments of objects that are physically inaccessible to us in the world today, which is one of the reasons I'm very interested in the space program, because the space program is made up almost entirely of things that we can't actually touch. I'm very interested in the difference between something that you can stand next to, that you can physically experience, as opposed to something that you can only experience through pictures or media. So my projects follow a process that I call undigitization. I start out doing a lot of research on something, say the Voyager space probe that was sent into space in the 1970s. But I do very basic research, the kind of research anyone could do. I Google searches, things in books, things that are very easily accessible to me. And then I build a very detailed digital model of the object and transform it in a way that I can remake it myself, reenact it, as I say, out of plywood. And very simple kind of DIY materials, plywood, steel, stuff that sort of anyone can use. And so in that process, I essentially sort of reconstitute something that is now just pixels into something that's actually physical. What that allows is for me to stand next to the object, to actually experience it as a physical thing, which is always kind of quite striking. Something like the Voyager you never see with any real context. It's a spacecraft. And so to pluck this object out of imagery and to sort of remake it as a physical thing is 2 things. First, it's an exploration of the difference, and secondly, I guess in some way it's a tribute to the object itself, because the object itself is something that I find kind of very interesting for any number of reasons. The Voyager is something that was sent out, far out into space, for the purpose of knowing more about it, of getting closer to that which is so far away from us. It brings back useful information about the universe, but it's information that doesn't have a really direct economic or military benefit. It's almost pure research, which has a beauty to me. But it was also sent out with this golden record attached. They produced a disc, an LP actually, made of gold, on which they encoded hundreds of sounds from the world. And so on that level, it's also it's a greeting. It's a greeting to the aliens. So there's something kind of quite wonderful about that, a sort of open-heartedness about it as a project that I find really very kind of almost moving, I'd say. The Apollo mission stuff, the lunar rover and the mission control, look at something a little different. They look at that, the romance of space exploration, I guess. But they also look at that other side of the space program, which is the idea that it was all fake, that it was all staged. And so, in some ways, that work talks a little bit about our trust in the media and in a mediated world. We know that the moon landings happened because we saw them on TV. None of us will ever actually be able to go out there and stand next to the lunar rover. So we just have to trust them. And so to me, that object there is very much about that trust that we have in what we hear, our acceptance that we're being told the truth. But it's also about that bunch of people who refuse to accept, even in the face of all the evidence that anything actually happened. So that dilemma of trust and that requirement of trust is sort of something that I'm quite interested in, because we do increasingly have to trust so much that we receive in this way. We can't see it with our own eyes so much. So that work, for me, kind of plays on that idea. I get to know these objects in very great detail, and then I produce a model that allows me to break them down into flat plywood sheets. I'm very interested in these kind of very everyday, ordinary materials that I work with. And so those plywood parts are designed by me as kind of flat objects and then laser cut. And I'm delivered to my studio here a big bunch of small and large, obscure-looking plywood parts, all flat-packed. And I then assemble them together like a giant kind of Meccano set or something made of wood. I call my projects My Voyager and My Lunar Rover, and that's for a couple of reasons. The first is because I don't see them as reproductions. A reproduction is something that's attempting to absolutely capture and imitate incredibly convincingly, or as convincingly as possible, the real thing. Whereas I'm not interested in trying to trick anyone into thinking that they're standing next to the real Voyager. Instead, I'm more interested in reenacting it, in creating an object that stands that's physically accurate, that kind of encapsulates what it was in a kind of physical way, very much, but doesn't make you think that you're really seeing it. I'm not trying to trick anybody. And that's partially why I call it My Voyager. It isn't the Voyager. It isn't the Voyager. It's My Voyager, the one that I made. And partly, too, that suggests that maybe anyone could make a Voyager. Maybe you don't need to be NASA. So there's a kind of there's a little sort of joke for me on that idea that somebody in their backyard could end up sort of redoing what these extraordinary kind of industrial, military, scientific institutions can actually manage. So there's a kind of joke in that, also in the fact that they're made of wood and they'll never fly. These are objects that I love. I'm not making fun of them or any way. I mean, there's a certain degree of critique, but there's actually an enormous amount of admiration. And so that thing of doing it yourself it's a tribute to those things, and I guess it's also a tribute to the obsessiveness of the people behind them. Each of these projects represents a process that took many incredibly dedicated and altruistic people an enormous amount of time to achieve. So there's an obsessiveness in celebrating their obsessiveness. My mission control actually includes a video work that is a documentation of a performance that I did here in the studio, where I essentially reenacted the spacewalks that the Apollo astronauts took. You'll see I fashioned an enormous kind of gantry and hooked myself up to springs, which I calibrated to ensure that they gave me the sort of weight on the ground equivalent to the moon's gravity. I built myself my own plywood spacesuit and all this sort of stuff, and I went kind of bounding across. It results in a kind of quite funny video of something that actually looks remarkably like a spacewalk. So again, it's sort of taking that process of reenactment of the object into the space of the documented event, the famous kind of spacewalk, and goes back and comments on that idea of whether it really did happen. But really, I've never really wanted to be an astronaut. That's not my interest. My interest is really more in the people behind the astronauts, the people that are sort of working in the kind of unglorious end of it, fashioning the machines and the processes and stuff that get people sort of up, and that bring us more knowledge about the universe, that make images that aren't necessarily useful but are extraordinarily beautiful. I guess what I'd like people to take away from these works is a sense of wonder at the objects themselves. The thing that always strikes me when I make these pieces is that no matter how well I know the object, no matter how long I've researched it, how many times I've gone over the model in 3D or any of those things, I'm always amazed by how big or small they actually are. I always think to myself, gosh, I didn't expect it would be like that. And so I would like other people to have that experience and come away with a sense that they really kind of know this thing as an object now as well as just pictures. I guess what I would say to a young person who was hoping to do the sort of things that I'm doing was that you really have to, well, firstly, you really have to want to do it, because there's a lot of time where you'll really be the only person that's pushing it along. So I think the ability to do it despite everything, I think, is absolutely vital to any artist. It's all, you need to be able to make your own opportunities and be very flexible. That's certainly, if you look at the way that my career's evolved, it's twisted and turned and followed a lot of things that have come up along the way. But I've always had that sense of really wanting to make art, so it's been about finding ways to do it rather than waiting for some sort of fit into some existing kind of context.